The knock wasn't ordinary. It wasn't the light tap of a neighbor or the friendly rhythm of a delivery driver. It was heavy, measured, demanding, the kind of knock that said, "Open up, or we'll open it for you." Colonel Elijah Ward stood frozen in the foyer of his two-story home, sunlight spilling across the polished floorboards. Outside, through the frosted glass, three silhouettes waited, broad-shouldered men in dark uniforms that didn't belong to any real department. Their badges gleamed, their posture rigid. Their vehicles, black SUVs with magnetic decals, idled at the curb like they owned the street. When Elijah finally opened the door, the air changed. One of the men, tall and red-faced, stepped forward, hand resting on his hip where a holstered weapon sat. Real or fake, it didn't matter yet. "Sir," the man barked, though Elijah hadn't said a word. "We're here on behalf of the Homeowners Association. You're under investigation for violating community standards. You need to come with us." The words didn't make sense. Under investigation? Arrested? Elijah's eyes flicked to the patch on the man's chest. HOA Enforcement Unit. It wasn't real. None of it was. But they believed in their performance too much. Behind them, neighbors peeked through curtains, phones raised discreetly. Every second stretched, a silent trial unfolding under the suburban sun. Elijah's jaw tightened. His voice, calm but edged with authority, cut through the quiet. "You're not police." The lead man smirked, taking a step closer. "We can make things real fast, or we can make them real hard." A breeze swept through the street, rustling flags and mailboxes. The men's boots scraped the concrete as they advanced one slow step at a time, circling the decorated veteran who had once led raids across oceans, but now stood accused of cutting his own grass too high and parking his government vehicle on the street. It wasn't about rules. It never was. One of the men reached toward Elijah's arm. The veteran's posture shifted, small, deliberate, and unmistakably commanding. His eyes hardened, the same way they had on deployment when seconds meant survival. But this wasn't a war zone. This was home. And somehow it felt worse. Because in this fight, the battlefield was perception. And all it took was one raised voice, one wrong move, to turn a proud man's legacy into a headline. Somewhere down the block, a camera phone caught the moment his composure met their aggression. And in that still frame, the story of power, race, and identity was about to explode. He didn't know it yet, but before the sun set, the whole nation would know his name. Long before the knock at his door, Elijah Ward lived a life defined by precision. Every morning, before the neighborhood even stirred, he was up, running the same 4-mile loop through the quiet, manicured streets of Silver Pines Estates. The air always carried that early stillness, where sprinklers hissed and porch lights blinked out one by one. To most, Elijah was simply Mr. Ward, a quiet man with a clean driveway, a disciplined gait, and a presence that made even casual conversation feel measured. He rarely raised his voice, never missed a trash day, and always waved to the mail carrier. But inside his home, inside his head, lived a man shaped by 22 years of service. Decorated, respected, and once feared. The walls of his study told part of the story. Plaques, framed commendations, a folded flag in glass. But what the neighbors didn't see were the scars beneath his sleeve or the nights he sat in silence, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the window, remembering things he could never explain. After retiring from the military, Elijah had joined a federal task force specializing in counterintelligence, the kind of work that required calm under chaos and an understanding of how people broke. His colleagues called him the quiet storm. When he left that world too, he did so quietly, seeking peace for his wife, Denise, and their teenage son, Marcus. Silver Pines had promised that peace. It was supposed to be safe, clean lawns, good schools, no drama. The kind of suburban promise families worked decades for. But peace, Elijah would learn, is a fragile illusion when people decide you don't belong. The first signs were small. A note on his windshield reminding him of parking rules. A neighbor who stopped mid-wave when Elijah's garage door opened to reveal his black SUV, government issued, with subtle armor plating and a tactical gear case still bolted in the back. Then came the letters, typed and signed, stuffed in his mailbox like warnings. Some of us worked hard to move here. This community has standards. Be mindful of how you represent yourself. At first, he ignored them. He'd faced worse. But Denise noticed. She noticed everything. The way his shoulders tensed whenever he checked the mail, the silence that replaced his morning hums. "Elijah," she said one evening, as they sat by the window watching the neighborhood kids ride bikes. "They're testing you. Don't let them." He only nodded, staring at the sunset, the kind that painted the houses gold, the same light that now felt false, like it hid something underneath. Because he could feel it. The weight of eyes, the shifting energy of a place that prided itself on civility while hiding its prejudice behind HOA bylaws and concerned citizen committees. The breaking point began, ironically, with kindness. Marcus had been selling fundraiser chocolates for his high school football team. Elijah had walked door to door with him, smiling, patient, letting his son take the lead. Most doors opened warmly. Some didn't open at all. But one, near the end of the block, opened halfway, just enough for a woman's voice to say, "We don't buy from strangers." Then it slammed shut. Marcus had laughed it off. Elijah hadn't. He recognized the look in her eyes. Not fear, not irritation, something colder. Recognition. He realized then, she didn't see neighbors. She saw trespassers. From that moment, Silver Pines was no longer a place of rest. It was a quiet battlefield. The HOA began inspections. Anonymous calls reported unauthorized guests. One morning, a note appeared taped to his front door. "We're watching. Respect the rules or face removal." It would have been laughable if it didn't feel so orchestrated. Denise urged him to document everything, and he did. But deep down, Elijah wasn't just cataloging threats. He was profiling. Old habits resurfaced, observing, connecting dots, tracing language patterns in the notes, noticing which vehicles circled the block twice instead of once. These weren't bored residents. This was organized. Someone wanted to make an example out of him. One Saturday morning, as he mowed the lawn, he noticed two unfamiliar men across the street, middle-aged, fit, pretending to check a power line box. They weren't electricians. Their boots were tactical. Their stance too deliberate. When their eyes met, they turned away, disappearing down the block. That night, Elijah sat in his office, pulling up the HOA's member list. Several names stood out, one belonging to a local security consultant, another to a man with a private enforcement license revoked years prior. It clicked. The HOA police weren't a random stunt. They were ex-cops and wannabe vigilantes, building a false authority under the guise of community protection. And they had chosen him, a black homeowner, to test their power. He should have called the real police. He didn't, because Elijah knew men like them didn't stop when you called 911. They stopped when they feared consequences. And he was about to remind them what real authority looked like. That morning, the sun rose quiet over Silver Pines. The street was calm, lawns freshly watered, mailboxes lined in perfect rows. Elijah brewed coffee, read the news, and dressed, not in sweats or jeans, but in a pressed shirt and slacks. He moved with purpose, deliberate, like he was preparing for something inevitable. Denise noticed. "Is it today?" she asked softly. He didn't answer, but his silence said everything. She placed a hand on his arm. "Just remember who you are." He gave a small nod, not of fear, but of restraint, because he knew what was coming wasn't a fight for safety. It was a test of identity, of dignity in the face of humiliation. And when the knock finally came, that deep, rehearsed rhythm on the door, Elijah Ward didn't flinch. He exhaled once, steady, and opened it to find 3 men waiting, self-appointed enforcers of order, standing in front of a man who'd served real justice across continents. They thought they were about to arrest him. They didn't realize they were walking straight into a trap of their own making. The sound of the knock still hung in the air when Elijah opened the door. 3 men stood on his porch, each in Navy tactical-style uniforms, their vests marked with white letters that read HOA Enforcement Division, a phrase that didn't exist anywhere in law. Yet they wore it with confidence, like it meant something. The man in front, tall, barrel-chested, with a sunburned neck and mirrored sunglasses, stepped forward. His voice was slow, controlled, rehearsed. "Mr. Ward, we've received multiple complaints from residents regarding violations of community policy. We need you to come with us to the HOA office for questioning." Elijah didn't move. He simply looked at them, calm, unreadable. Behind him, Denise appeared in the hallway, her voice steady but sharp. "Questioning? Under what authority?" The man ignored her. His gaze stayed locked on Elijah. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way, sir." Something flickered in Elijah's eyes, not fear, but recognition. He'd seen this type before. The kind who mistook intimidation for power. The kind who played soldier without understanding the weight of it. He said nothing, just stepped aside slightly, as if allowing them to dig their own hole. "Let me get my shoes," he said evenly. One of the men, younger, with nervous energy, smirked. "We'll wait." As Elijah turned back inside, he glanced once toward the bookshelf in his study. Beneath a row of framed commendations sat a small, unmarked black case. He didn't reach for it. He didn't need to. Not yet. He slipped on his shoes, adjusted his collar, and returned to the doorway. "All right," he said. "Let's talk." They let him outside, down the walkway where neighbors had begun to peek through blinds and half-open curtains. The spectacle was quiet but heavy, a slow, humiliating parade meant to send a message. We decide who belongs here. The leaders stopped beside their unmarked black SUV, a vehicle with magnetic decals, as fake as their authority. "We're detaining you for noncompliance with community security protocols," he said, unfolding a laminated sheet that looked vaguely official. "You refused multiple notices." Elijah studied the paper, bold headers, legal-sounding language, no signatures. A prop. He looked up at the man and asked, "You made this yourself?" The man stiffened. "It's HOA policy." "No," Elijah replied softly. "It's a forgery." The leader blinked, uncertain how to respond. He wasn't used to calm resistance, only fear. And the quiet confidence in Elijah's tone rattled him more than shouting ever could. "I'm not going anywhere," Elijah said, his voice low even. "And unless you want to be explaining this to actual law enforcement in the next 5 minutes, I suggest you step off my property." Behind him, Denise stood on the porch, phone in hand, recording. Her expression was composed but furious, a mirror of his restraint. The leader took a step closer. "Sir, I'm not going to warn you again." Elijah tilted his head slightly. "Then don't." The moment stretched, heavy, dangerous. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. The younger man at the SUV's rear shifted uneasily, glancing between his partners. He hadn't signed up for this. The third, older, with a scar along his jawline, muttered under his breath, "Just cuff him." That was their mistake. Elijah didn't move, but his presence filled the space. There was something in his stillness that unsettled them, an invisible weight that whispered experience, precision, control. When the scarred man reached for his cuffs, Elijah spoke, quietly, but with authority that cut through the noise like a blade. "You ever wonder what happens when you pick the wrong man?" The man froze mid-motion. Elijah stepped forward, slow and deliberate. "I've trained people like you. I've interrogated people like you. I've buried men who thought the badge they made up meant they could control fear." The leader's composure cracked. "What did you just say?" Elijah's tone never rose. "You came to my home pretending to enforce rules you invented. You tried to humiliate a veteran on his own doorstep. You call this a neighborhood watch. I call it a hate crime." He reached into his pocket, not for a weapon, but for a leather wallet. He flipped it open. Inside, glinting in the morning light, was his federal badge, the gold eagle, the seal, the letters, Federal Bureau of Investigation. The man's breath caught, his hand instinctively lowered. Elijah's voice hardened. "You didn't come for me because of an HOA policy. You came because I'm black, and I didn't fit your idea of who belongs here." He paused, letting the silence do the work. Now you're going to explain to me why you thought that was a good idea. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, from across the street, a screen door creaked open. A neighbor stepped out, phone raised, already recording. Another joined. Then another. Within seconds, half the cul-de-sac was watching. The leader shifted his stance, sweat glinting at his temple. The calm authority he once wielded had evaporated. Elijah, Denise said quietly from the porch. Let them talk. So he did. The leader stammered, trying to piece together something coherent. We've had issues with break-ins lately. You matched. Matched what? Elijah interrupted, his voice cutting sharp. A description? Of who? The man faltered. Go on, Elijah pressed. Say it. You thought the black man mowing his own lawn was a threat. The silence that followed was deafening. The only sound was the faint buzz of a nearby lawn trimmer. The normal world still spinning, while this one fractured. Denise's camera panned from their faces to the crowd forming behind. Elijah didn't move, didn't threaten, didn't raise his voice. But everything about him radiated command. He'd been in standoffs with armed terrorists and warlords. 3 fake officers, with clipboards and vanity badges, were nothing compared to that. Still, he could see it. The way their muscles tightened, how shame began twisting into defensiveness. And that, he knew, was the most dangerous moment. Shame could turn to violence in a heartbeat. Then came the sound. 2 distant sirens, faint at first, growing louder. Denise lowered her phone slightly. You called them. Elijah shook his head. No, but someone did. The leader exhaled in relief. Good. The real cops will sort this out. Elijah smiled, faintly, coldly. Yes, they will. Minutes later, 2 patrol cars rolled onto the street. Real officers stepped out, hands near their holsters, cautious. They saw the badges, the SUV, the uniforms, and hesitated. Everything all right here? One asked. The fake officers immediately began speaking over each other. We were conducting an HOA enforcement. This man was non-compliant. We had authorization. Elijah waited until they finished their panicked justifications. Then, slowly, he stepped forward, holding up his badge. Agent Elijah Ward, FBI. The officers froze. One blinked twice, recognition dawning. Sir, we didn't. He handed them a card. Call that number. Confirm it. They did, and the change in their faces told the story. Eyes widening, posture straightening. Suddenly, the power dynamic shifted again, this time irrevocably. The officer on the left turned toward the 3 imposters. You boys have about 10 seconds to explain yourselves. The leader's face went pale. We were following community. Community what? The officer barked. You impersonated law enforcement. You detained a federal agent. You understand what that means. Elijah said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence was its own indictment. As the fake officers were cuffed and led toward their SUV, the watching neighbors whispered, some in shock, others in shame. One woman, the same who'd refused to buy chocolate from Marcus weeks earlier, stood at her window, hand over her mouth. Denise stepped beside Elijah, her hand brushing his. It's over. He shook his head. Not yet. Because Elijah knew this wasn't the end, this was exposure. The beginning of something larger. As the police read them their rights, one of the imposters muttered, You think you're better than us, don't you? Elijah finally looked at him. No, he said quietly. I just know who I am. And in that moment, surrounded by flashing lights and whispering neighbors, he wasn't just a victim of a hate-fueled stunt. He was the mirror they tried to avoid, the proof of everything they denied about themselves. That night, the videos spread across social media. Clips of the confrontation hit 1 million views in hours. The hashtags trended. Hashtag #FakeHOAPolice. Hashtag Elijah Ward. Hashtag This Is America. Commenters from across the country called it another symptom of suburban racism, the quiet, polished kind that hides behind community standards. By morning, reporters were calling. The HOA issued a statement, distancing itself from the rogue volunteers. But Elijah knew better, because racism doesn't always wear a hood or shout slurs. Sometimes it dresses in uniforms and pretends it's keeping order, and that, he realized, was the truth he'd spent a lifetime fighting, in war zones, in cities, and now on his own front lawn. By dawn, the quiet suburban street looked like a crime scene and a film set at once. Yellow tape cordoned off Elijah's driveway. Local news vans lined the curb, their antennas jutting up like silver reeds. The soft hum of generators and whispered commentary filled the morning air. From the kitchen window, Elijah watched them gather. Reporters rehearsing lines, cameramen adjusting lenses, neighbors pretending to walk dogs just to get a closer look. He didn't move. He just stood there, mug in hand, face unreadable. Denise appeared behind him, robe tied tight, eyes rimmed with fatigue. "They've been out there since 5, she murmured. "Someone from Channel 9 wants a statement." He shook his head. "Not yet. They're saying those men were part of a private security firm hired by the HOA. He let out a bitter laugh. "Private security? That's one way to spin vigilantes, with clipboards." Marcus came downstairs, still in his pajamas, hair mussed. "Dad, why are we on the news?" Elijah crouched beside him, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Because some people did something wrong, son, and we have to make sure the truth gets told." Marcus looked at the cameras through the window. "Did they hurt you?" Elijah smiled faintly. "They tried to, but your dad's fine." By mid-morning, the footage had gone national. Cable networks ran slow-motion clips of confrontation. The moment Elijah flashed his badge, the look on the imposters' faces, Denise's calm recording. Every outlet had its own version of the story. Some called it a stunning case of racial profiling. Others framed it as a misunderstanding gone viral. But what caught Elijah's attention wasn't what was being said. It was what wasn't. No one mentioned how organized those men had been. The matching uniforms, the SUV, the manufactured paperwork. That wasn't a prank. That was preparation. And Elijah Ward had spent enough of his life studying threats to know when one was coordinated. Later that day, his phone buzzed. A block number. He recognized the cadence of that call, official, internal. He answered. "Ward. Agent Ward, this is Assistant Director Marlowe." The voice was clipped, professional, but weighted with unease. "We've reviewed the footage. We need you to come in." "Am I under review?" "Not exactly," Marlowe replied. "But this incident just hit the Bureau's radar, and it stirred up a storm we can't ignore." Elijah sighed. "I'll be there in an hour." At Quantico, the atmosphere was taut. He walked the familiar corridors, past framed photos of agents lost in the line of duty, past whispers that quieted as he passed. In the conference room, Marlowe sat with 2 others, Internal Affairs and PR. Their faces were a study in damage control. "Agent Ward," Marlowe began, "you're not in trouble, but this situation is delicate. The video has millions of views. You've become a symbol." "A symbol of what?" Elijah asked. "That's the problem," said the PR officer, a woman in her 40s with sympathetic eyes. "For some, you're a hero, the veteran who stood up to hate. For others, you're proof that the Bureau's overreaching again. We've had calls from Congress, from advocacy groups, from people who've never set foot in my shoes." Elijah finished. Marlowe leaned forward. "We're not asking you to apologize, but we are asking you to stay quiet until we sort this out. No interviews, no statements. Let us handle it." Elijah's jaw flexed. "And what happens when silence looks like complicity?" Marlowe hesitated. "We protect the Bureau's image. And yours." He rose slowly, meeting Marlowe's gaze. "You don't protect me. You manage me." The room went still. He turned and left. That night, Denise found him in the garage. He was sitting at his old workbench, polishing a medal, the silver star he'd earned overseas, the one he never displayed. "You used to hate cleaning those," she said softly. He didn't look up. "They're reminders of what happens when power gets misused." She stepped closer. You're thinking of doing something, aren't you? He sighed. Those men didn't act alone. You don't assemble fake uniforms, badges, and policies without backing. Someone financed it. Someone wanted to provoke a reaction. Why you? She asked. He paused. Because I'm visible, decorated, respected. The kind of man they think won't fight back too hard. Denise shook her head. You can't fix this alone. He gave a small, weary smile. I never do things alone. She placed a hand on his shoulder. Then promise me, whatever you find, you bring it home. Don't let this take more from you than it already has. He nodded. I promise. But she saw the look in his eyes, the one that always came before he went hunting for truth, the same look he'd worn in Fallujah, in Kabul, in too many places that left marks no metal could cover. The next day, the HOA called an emergency meeting. The community center was packed. Homeowners, reporters, cameras, tension. Elijah walked in wearing a charcoal suit, every eye tracking him. The HOA president, a man named Richard Hensley, cleared his throat nervously. Mr. Ward, we're sorry for the incident. These individuals acted without authorization. We had no idea they were. Impersonating officers? Elijah interrupted. Conducting detainment on private property. That's not just unauthorized. That's criminal. Murmurs rippled through the room. Hensley tried to smile. We're cooperating with authorities. We've terminated their contracts. What contracts? Elijah asked. Show me the paperwork. The room fell silent. I've done my homework, Elijah continued. The company listed on your invoices, Neighborhood Integrity Services, doesn't exist. Its business registration leads to a P.O. box in another state, and the account used to pay them was opened under your name. Gasps echoed. Hensley's face drained of color. That's not possible. Elijah's tone stayed calm. It's possible, because you signed it. He slid a folder onto the table, copies of emails, bank transfers, and fake HOA bylaws. How did you get these? Hensley demanded. Elijah's eyes hardened. I'm the one man you shouldn't try to intimidate with that question. The board members stared at the documents in stunned silence. One of them, a woman with trembling hands, whispered, Oh my God, we've been laundering funds. Denise, filming from the back of the room, caught every word. Hensley stammered. You're twisting this. We were protecting the neighborhood. From what? Elijah asked. People like me? The tension broke. Someone shouted, He's right. Another demanded Hensley's resignation. Chaos erupted, voices overlapping, cameras flashing, order dissolving into outrage. Hensley tried to leave, but 2 police officers intercepted him at the door. Elijah didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just watched, the same steady calm as always. Because this wasn't victory. This was exposure. And exposure, he knew, always came with a cost. That night, threats began arriving. Anonymous emails. A note taped to the mailbox that read, You're not one of us. Denise wanted to leave. Elijah refused. This is exactly what they want, he said. For us to run. But Marcus. He'll be safe, Elijah said. Because I'll make sure of it. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something larger was moving beneath the surface. A network. Not just a few racist neighbors. Someone had resources. Structure. Strategy. So he dug deeper. Old contacts and cybercrime traced the fake company's payment trail. It led not to a suburban account, but to a private contractor in Virginia. One that had quietly bid on federal surveillance contracts before being blacklisted for misconduct. He recognized one of the names. Hensley's brother-in-law. By the 3rd day, the pressure hit a breaking point. Cable pundits debated whether Elijah had provoked the situation. Trolls flooded his inbox with hate. A thinly veiled hit piece claimed he had a history of aggression. It was character assassination, orchestrated, not spontaneous. Denise urged him to respond publicly. People need to hear from you. He looked at her. They've already decided what they want to believe. Then give them something they can't ignore. He thought about it, long and hard. That night, he set up his phone, adjusted the lighting, and hit record. He didn't use the FBI badge. He didn't wear a suit. Just a t-shirt and the truth. "My name is Elijah Ward," he began. "I served this country for 20 years, overseas and here at home. I believed in justice. Still do. But last week, men pretending to be officers came to my house because they didn't think I belonged in my own neighborhood." He paused. "This isn't just my story. This is what happens when hate wears a uniform and calls itself order. And if we keep pretending it's isolated, if we keep forgiving it because it's polite, then we've already lost more than we realize." He let the silence linger, then ended the recording. The video exploded. Not because it was angry, but because it was measured, honest, unflinching. It hit 10 million views in 2 days. Celebrities reposted it. Civil rights groups rallied behind him. The HOA board dissolved under federal investigation. But fame was never what Elijah wanted, and it brought its own dangers. A black SUV began appearing near his house at night. Not police. Not local. The kind that didn't want to be seen, but didn't care if you noticed. One evening, as he walked Marcus home from basketball practice, Elijah spotted it again, parked across from the park entrance. Headlights off. Engine running. He put a hand on his son's shoulder. "Get in the car, buddy." "Why?" "Just do it." Marcus obeyed, sensing something in his father's tone. Elijah stood there, staring at the SUV. He knew how intimidation worked, slow erosion, constant pressure, until fear became routine. He wasn't going to let that happen. He approached the vehicle. The tinted window lowered halfway. A man inside, face obscured, spoke without looking at him. "Agent Ward, you should have stayed quiet." Elijah's pulse didn't change. That a threat? The man smiled faintly. "A reminder. You're making powerful enemies." "Good," Elijah said. "Means I'm over the target." The window rolled up. The SUV pulled away. Elijah stood there under the streetlight, the echo of the engine fading into the night. When he returned home, Denise was waiting at the door. "I saw the car," she whispered. He nodded. "They're watching, which means we're getting close." "Close to what?" He hesitated. "Who's really behind this?" She took his hands. "Elijah, how far are you willing to go?" He looked into her eyes. The woman who'd waited through deployments, held him through nightmares, raised their son while he fought wars overseas and within himself. "As far as I have to," he said. The next morning, he found an envelope slipped under the door. No return address. No postage. Inside, a single sheet of paper. Typed. Cold. Precise. "You think you're uncovering corruption, but you're digging into something much bigger. Walk away, Agent Ward, or next time we won't knock." Elijah folded the letter neatly and placed it on the table. Then he reached for his phone. "Marlowe," he said when his superior answered. "I'm going to need full clearance. Surveillance data, contractor records, HOA communications, all of it." Marlowe hesitated. "Ward, you're not officially on this case." "I am now." That was the moment the battle changed. It was no longer about a few racist neighbors or fake officers. It was about a system that enabled them and the shadowed money that armed them. Elijah Ward wasn't just defending his home anymore. He was preparing for war. The storm outside had turned the sky into bruised gray glass, lightning flickering behind the clouds like a slow pulse. Elijah sat at his dining table, laptop open, the glow painting his face in pale blue light. Lines of code scrolled across the screen. Data streams, metadata traces, encrypted files scraped from the HOA server and routed through hidden accounts. For a moment, it almost felt like his old days in the Bureau cyber unit. Long nights tracing digital ghosts through servers that didn't want to be found. Except this time, the trail led to his own backyard. Denise walked in quietly, placing a cup of coffee beside him. "You've been at this for 6 hours," she said. "You promised me you'd sleep." "I will," he murmured. When I find out who signed this payment." She sighed, kissed the back of his head, and walked away, but not before glancing at the screen and noticing the words Blackridge Consulting Group. At 3:47 a.m., Elijah froze. He stared at the routing number, tracing it backward through a web of shell accounts until a name appeared that made his stomach tighten. Nathan Pierce, Assistant Regional Director, FBI. His former superior. The realization hit like a physical blow. Blackridge was one of the contractors Pierce had vouched for years ago. The same firm now laundering money through fake HOA security operations. He leaned back in his chair, breath shallow. This wasn't coincidence. This was infrastructure. He copied everything onto an encrypted drive, shut the laptop, and sat in silence. Lightning flashed again, and in that brief illumination, Elijah caught his own reflection in the window, tired eyes, clenched jaw. A man who had spent his life upholding the law only to find it staring back at him like a mirror, cracked down the middle. By dawn, the world outside was calm again, but inside him, something had shifted. He wasn't just dealing with corrupt neighbors or rogue hires anymore. He was staring at a machine that had turned bias into business, and his own agency's fingerprints were on the switch. He knew what came next: evidence, chain of custody, verification. But he also knew the system wasn't designed to expose itself. So he turned to the only person who still had pull inside without being complicit: Agent Maya Torres, an old friend and former partner, now in the Bureau's Integrity Division. He called her from a burner line. "Maya, it's Ward." There was a pause, then a wary exhale. "You're not supposed to be using this number." "I know, but you need to hear what I found." He gave her the basics: the fake HOA, the funding trail, Pierce's involvement. She didn't interrupt. When he finished, she said quietly, "You're telling me an assistant director is tied to an operation targeting homeowners based on race?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you." Another silence, heavier this time. "Elijah," she said finally, "if you're right, you're sitting on a live grenade. Pierce isn't just management, he's connected. Political donors, defense contracts. Half the oversight board owes him favors. You go after him, they'll make you the story." "I already am the story." She sighed. "Send me what you have. I'll vet it off the record." That night, Elijah slipped the encrypted drive into a FedEx envelope, addressed it to Maya's home, and dropped it at a 24-hour box. He watched it disappear into the slot, the hum of fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. It felt like sliding a confession into the mouth of fate. When he returned home, Denise was waiting by the stairs. "You sent it, didn't you?" He nodded. She looked scared. "You know what happens when you expose powerful people." "I'm not exposing them," he said. "I'm documenting them." She stared at him for a long moment. "There's no difference, Elijah." The following afternoon, Maya called. Her voice was tight, urgent. Elijah listened carefully. "You were right. The payments linked directly to Blackridge, and Pierce authorized them under a Homeland Infrastructure contract that doesn't exist. But there's something worse." "What?" "Blackridge has subcontracts across 6 states, all under fake community security initiatives. They're creating patrol programs, neighborhood watch groups, even civilian enforcement units under the guise of local policy." Elijah's blood ran cold. "Private policing networks." "Yes, and guess which neighborhoods they're targeting?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Maya continued, "Pierce isn't just laundering money. He's testing a model, privatized authority without accountability. If this goes unchecked, it's not just racism anymore. It's infrastructure for a new kind of segregation." Elijah's grip tightened on the phone. "Then we stop it." There was a pause. "We can't do this alone. I'll pull what evidence I can internally, but you need to protect yourself. Pierce will know someone leaked. He'll look your way first." Elijah exhaled slowly. Let him look. 2 nights later, while Denise and Marcus were asleep, Elijah stepped outside to clear his head. The neighborhood was silent, too silent. A motion light flickered near the garage. He scanned the yard, nothing. Then he saw it. A small red laser gliding across the driveway, landing on the mailbox. He ducked instinctively, rolled behind the car, and drew the weapon he'd kept holstered since leaving field duty. Silence. Then a low rumble, tires crunching over gravel. The same black SUV. Elijah raised his phone and snapped a photo of the plates as it sped off. When he checked the image, his stomach dropped. No plates. Just a black square where they should have been. By morning, Maya's name appeared on every news channel. The official story claimed she was suspended pending investigation for leaking classified data. No mention of what data. No mention of Pierce. Elijah threw the remote across the room. Denise startled. What happened? They're going after her, he said. They found out. Then you're next. He didn't answer. He just walked to his desk, opened a locked drawer, and retrieved an old bureau-issued encrypted drive. It contained backups of every major investigation he'd ever led, some declassified, some not. And somewhere in those files were enough connections to show how deeply Pierce had buried his network. He'd been trained to build cases from ashes. Now he'd have to do it while being hunted by his own. That evening, as rain began to fall, Elijah drove to an old church on the edge of town. It wasn't a sanctuary, it was a meeting point. Inside, sitting in the back pew, was an elderly man in a worn coat, Reverend Samuel Price, one of Elijah's old informants from a domestic terror task force years ago. Agent Ward, the Reverend said softly, I've been watching the news. Looks like the wolves have turned inward. Elijah sat beside him. You've still got eyes on the malicious circles. Price chuckled. Always. Hate's a loyal customer. I need names, Elijah said. Anyone who's worked with private firms under the name Blackridge, especially on recruitment. Price's expression darkened. You don't want that list, son. I need it. Price studied him a moment, then nodded slowly. You're chasing something that doesn't want to be caught, but I'll send what I have. He leaned closer. Be careful who you trust. They're not just guarding money. They're guarding belief. 3 days later, an encrypted email arrived. No sender, no signature. Attached, a spreadsheet of over 70 names. Private contractors, former law enforcement officers, ex-military, all recruited into community enforcement programs funded by Blackridge subsidiaries. And next to some of those names, HOA associations. Elijah scrolled until he saw it. Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association, his neighborhood. Every muscle in his body went cold. This wasn't random. This wasn't chance. He'd been the test subject from the start. The fake HOA officers hadn't picked his house because they didn't like him. They'd picked it because his profile, successful, disciplined, black, respected, made him the perfect trigger. If he reacted violently, they'd prove their need for security. If he didn't, they'd humiliate him into silence. Either way, they'd win. But he hadn't played their script. He'd flipped it. And now they were unraveling. That night, he drove to the outskirts of the city, to a vacant lot behind an old warehouse. A meet-up with an investigative journalist from an independent outlet who'd reached out after his viral video. Her name was Lena Carter, mid-30s, sharp, cautious. She arrived in an old Toyota, camera bag slung over her shoulder. You said you had something that'll blow the lid off this, she asked. Elijah handed her a USB drive. Everything's on here. Financial records, fake contracts, communication logs, proof of a federally tied network funding private racial policing. She hesitated. You're sure this is real? He looked her dead in the eye. It's real. And when you publish it, they'll come for you too. She nodded slowly. Then we better make sure it's too big to bury. 2 days later, the story dropped. Inside the Shadow Network. How private policing exploits racial fear. The article exploded across social media, part expose, part whistleblower testimony. It named Pierce directly. It referenced Elijah's neighborhood by pseudonym, but didn't hide the implication. Within hours, congressional committees demanded answers. Pierce went on medical leave. The Bureau denied everything, but the damage was done. For the first time, the machinery that thrived in silence was dragged into the light. That night, Elijah sat on the porch with Denise. The air was still, heavy with the scent of rain-soaked pine. You did it, she whispered. He shook his head. No, I just opened a door. What comes through it, that's on the rest of them. Do you think they'll stop? He stared into the distance, the street where his son had learned to ride a bike, the sidewalk where the fake officers had once stood. "No," he said quietly. "They'll just change the name, rewrite the rules, paint the same fence a different color." She took his hand. Then what was the point? He looked at her, eyes tired but steady. "The point," he said, "is that for once, they didn't get to write the ending." The next morning, Marcus bounded down the stairs, holding a newspaper. "Dad, look, front page. FBI launches internal inquiry following racism scandal." Beneath it, a photo of Elijah from his viral video, his face calm but resolute. He smiled faintly. "Guess I'm trending again." Denise chuckled softly. "Not the kind of fame most people want." He shrugged. "It's not about fame. It's about record. If history's going to be written, I'd rather my name be in the footnotes than erased." Later that day, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He almost ignored it, but something made him answer. A familiar voice crackled through. "Elijah." "Maya, I can't talk long," she whispered. "I'm under protection. But listen, the internal review found files they didn't expect. Not just Pierce's. There's a whole division behind this. Higher than him. Blackridge was just a test run." Elijah's pulse quickened. "How far does it go?" "Farther than you think," she said. "And they're already building something new. Different name. Same structure." The line clicked dead. Elijah stared at the silent phone, the hum of the world around him returning. Lawn mowers, birds, a child's laughter down the block. Normal life, layered over secrets. He stood, slipped his phone into his pocket, and walked to the window. Across the street, an unfamiliar sedan sat idling. No markings, no movement. He smiled faintly. They were still watching. But so was he. That night, Elijah sat at his desk, opened a new file, and began typing. Title, Operation Blackridge. Internal account, Agent Elijah Ward. He started at the beginning. Every detail, every timestamp, every name. Because truth wasn't just something you exposed once. It was something you preserved, in ink, in record, in defiance. And as the cursor blinked on the screen, he felt something unfamiliar stirring inside him. Not victory, not vengeance. Resolve. The night after everything happened, the neighborhood was eerily quiet. The once bustling cul-de-sac, the one that used to hum with weekend laughter, barbecue smoke, and friendly waves, felt like it had stopped breathing. Curtains were still drawn tight. Porch lights glowed dim, uncertain. Even the crickets seemed to hush when they passed Marcus's house, as if the earth itself had paused to listen. Inside, the family sat together on the couch, Marcus, Danielle, and their teenage son, Evan. None of them spoke. The television flickered, replaying the viral footage that had already racked up over 20 million views in less than a day. The fake HOA officers being escorted out in handcuffs, the FBI insignia glinting under the evening sun, the stunned faces of neighbors realizing who their quiet, polite black neighbor truly was. But Marcus didn't smile. Not even when the anchor said his name with reverence. Decorated FBI agent Marcus Hall, a combat veteran and community advocate, was mistaken for a criminal by self-proclaimed HOA enforcers in an unfolding case of racial profiling. He just stared at the screen, not out of pride, but exhaustion, because he knew what the headlines wouldn't capture. That moment when he saw the rage and fear in his son's eyes. That split second when he thought of how easily things could have gone differently if he hadn't revealed who he was. If he hadn't had that badge, that training, that composure, that privilege of authority. For every Marcus who lived through it, he knew there were countless others who wouldn't. The following week, he stood in front of his house again, not in a tactical vest, not as the feared FBI agent, but as a father and a man reclaiming peace on his own lawn. A few journalists hovered at the end of the street, waiting for another statement. But Marcus didn't want attention. He wanted accountability. He glanced up the road. The same HOA board members who had avoided his gaze for months now stood awkwardly near the mailbox cluster, pretending to check their mail. One of them offered a hesitant wave. Marcus didn't return it, not out of bitterness, but because this wasn't about surface apologies anymore. Danielle joined him outside, her hand brushing his. "They're scared of you now," she whispered softly. Marcus shook his head. "They should be scared of themselves." She didn't answer, just leaned into him, her presence a quiet anchor in the swirl of noise surrounding them. Days turned into weeks. Investigations unfolded. The so-called HOA police were charged with impersonating law enforcement and trespassing. The incident sparked nationwide outrage and policy discussions about racial profiling in private communities. News networks dissected it. Law schools debated it. Activists cited it. And yet, inside Marcus's home, life returned to something close to ordinary. The mornings were quiet again. Evan went back to school. Danielle reopened her studio. The coffee maker clicked on at 6 a.m. sharp, just like before. But nothing truly felt the same. Because once you've seen how quickly peace can turn into chaos, how easily respect can dissolve into suspicion, you never look at your world the same way again. On a Sunday morning, Marcus finally did something he hadn't done in months. He opened his old service chest. Inside were medals, letters, photos, fragments of a lifetime spent protecting a nation that sometimes forgot to protect him back. He lifted a small plaque, tarnished with time, for courage and composure under pressure. He ran his fingers over the engraving and laughed under his breath. "Guess that's still my job." Evan appeared in the doorway, watching quietly. "Dad," he said after a pause, "did you ever think it would happen to you?" Marcus didn't answer right away. He looked at his son, tall for 15, with his mother's eyes and his quiet defiance. "I hoped it wouldn't," he finally said, "but I always knew it could." Evan frowned. "So what do we do now?" Marcus stood, walked to the window, and opened the blinds. Sunlight poured across the living room, warm, defiant light. "We teach them who we are," he said simply. "Every day. Not with anger, not with fear, but with truth." Weeks later, a town hall meeting was called, the biggest in the county's history. The incident had forced a reckoning. Local officials, law enforcement representatives, and homeowners from surrounding neighborhoods all gathered to discuss what had happened and what needed to change. When Marcus took the stage, the room fell silent. Cameras lined the walls, but his gaze was steady, fixed on the people in front of him, his neighbors, the same faces who had once whispered behind curtains and called security when his friends came over. "I've served this country in ways most people never see," he began, his voice low but resonant. "And the truth is, I never expected the battlefield to follow me home." A murmur rippled through the crowd. "I'm not here to shame anyone," he continued. "I'm here because what happened on my lawn isn't just about me. It's about what happens when fear wears a uniform, even a fake one. It's about how power can be abused not by systems, but by neighbors." He paused, scanning the crowd. Some avoided his eyes. Others looked down. "You see," he said, "racism doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers, through suspicion, through assumptions, through silence. And every time we let it slide, it grows louder." The air was thick with quiet guilt. Marcus's voice softened. "But I believe we can do better. We have to. Because if justice only works for people who look like me when they carry a badge, then it isn't justice at all." After the applause faded, the meeting didn't end with division, but with conversation. Real conversation. Committees formed. Policies were drafted. Some hearts stayed closed, but others cracked open. Outside, Marcus stood beneath the fading sky. The same neighborhood that once doubted him now looked different. Not perfect, not healed, but aware. Danielle joined him again, smiling faintly. "You did that," she said. He shook his head. "We did that. By surviving it." That night, Marcus sat at his desk, writing. Not a report, not a statement. A letter. To every person who had written to him since the story went viral. To every young man who said he finally saw himself in someone who didn't break. He wrote, "They thought they were protecting their neighborhood. What they were really protecting was a lie. That some people belong more than others. But the truth doesn't need permission to stand on its own front lawn. The truth doesn't wear a badge. It lives in how we treat each other when nobody's filming." He folded the paper, slipped it into a box, and turned off the lamp. Outside, the world moved on. But somewhere, in that quiet corner of suburbia, one man had turned a moment of humiliation into a message, one that would echo long after the cameras were gone. Marcus's story isn't just his own. It's the story of every person who's ever been questioned for existing in the wrong place, wearing the wrong face, speaking in the wrong tone. It's a reminder that racism doesn't always come in the form of slurs or violence. Sometimes it arrives dressed in authority, holding clipboards, smiling politely. So if you're watching this, don't just shake your head and move on. Look around. Ask yourself who you're standing beside and who you're standing against. Because silence doesn't keep the peace. It keeps the problem alive. Share stories like this. Talk about them. Learn from them. Because change doesn't come from outrage. It comes from understanding. Marcus once said, "They came to arrest me for being here, but I'm not going anywhere." And maybe that's the message we all need, that standing your ground isn't always about defiance. Sometimes it's about existence, about claiming the space you've already earned. Because until no one has to prove they belong, none of us truly do.